Hi, everybody. My name is Beth Fisher, and I am the program librarian here at the library. Today's program, as you can see up there, I want to thank the Department of German, as well as the Division of World Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at the university for co-sponsoring this event with us. Dr. Elke Heckner, I have cheat notes, sorry. Dr. Elke Heckner is a lecturer in the Department of German at the University of Iowa. She has published on the Holocaust and is currently completing a book entitled Thinking Memories of Futurity, the Holocaust and Armenian Genocide. This book focuses on recent paradigm shifts in second and third generation witnessing in film and memorial architecture. Dr. Heckner has been interviewed by Charity Nebbe on NPR's Talk of Iowa about Art Spiegelman's Pulitzer Prize-winning graphic novel MAUS, which has been in the news lately due to being banned, evil word, banned in January by the Tennessee School Board from its 8th grade curriculum. Apparently it's too disturbing for 8th graders. Starting later in fall 2022, Dr. Heckner will serve as the director of the Humanities Lab in Global Memory Studies in the Division of World Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at the University of Iowa. Her talk today is entitled, Why Art Spiegelman's MAUS in Holocaust Education.
Right. Okay, well, first of all, welcome everybody to our talk today on why we need Art Spiegelman in Holocaust education. And in a certain way, I never thought I'd have to defend Art Spiegelman because, as you all know, or many of you know, he won a Pulitzer Prize for his graphic novel. It's the only graphic novel in the genre that has won a Pulitzer Prize. Now, why was this book? I didn't want to delve too much into the debate on why Art Spiegelman has been deemed, this specific book has been deemed controversial, but I do want to remark that it is ironic and sad that on Holocaust Remembrance Day, the liberation of Auschwitz, January 27th, when the book was to be taught in a specific school in Tennessee, and you can Google it, this is very well documented, I don't want to go into details, the book was pulled, okay? It was pulled from the curriculum because it was deemed to be too dangerous and too risky for students. And of course, this raises the question, what is being taught in schools? Can we really assume that students or children have no independent judgment of their own? Do we need to ban books? Do we want to censor books? And why is the censoring of books not a replacement or substitute for difficult conversations one needs to have, right? And one other question that we do want to raise is what would it mean to deprive children, students, high school students, from a critical art education? This book had been scheduled for art education. Just for those of you who have not read MAUS, a couple of points on Art Spiegelman. Art Spiegelman is the son of Holocaust survivors. Both his parents survived Auschwitz. His mother, Anya, ended up killing herself. And this is, I shouldn't say very typical of Holocaust survivors, but it is a kind of, how to put it, a delayed response to what we call, in trauma studies, post-traumatic stress syndrome. A lot of Holocaust survivors end up taking their lives for lack of intervention, social isolation, lack of psychological or therapeutic services, right? And that is specifically horrific because here they have survived hell and then they end up killing themselves. So Art Spiegelman, his father, Vladek, both his father and his mother survived Auschwitz through a series of very lucky incidences, right? In many ways, to survive Auschwitz is already a kind of miracle, right? And Auschwitz was one of the places where concentration camp inmates, once they arrived, received tattoos. Those who were not selected out to go right away to the crematoria, i.e. women and children. The other ones, as we also discussed in class, received tattoo on their arms to basically be worked to death in factories, in munition factories, to support the German war effort, right? So basically, Jewish concentration camp prisoners were not meant to survive Auschwitz, right? So here is Spiegelman. He is second generation. The notion of the generational difference is very, very important in this book, because much of this book is about how Spiegelman experienced Auschwitz when he was growing up with his father and his family in Rego Park, right? How Auschwitz, in a certain way, was always present at the dinner table, even without being necessarily articulated, right? And he describes how he and his dad had this very difficult and often painful relationship. Art Spiegelman was an American kid. He was into comics. He was into pop culture. His dad was almost from a kind of different world. And towards the end of Vladek's life, Art Spiegelman embarked on this project in which he interviewed his father on tapes. And some of these interviews are going to make it into the comic, okay? So he was born in 1948 in Stockholm, Sweden. Both of his parents were Polish Jews. They immigrated to the US in 1951. And Art Spiegelman is a comic book illustrator. He developed an interest in comics early on, and he published actually his first series of comics in a magazine called Mad. And this is the first series of panels from MAUS. So this was published in an anthology called Funny Animals. And for those of you who are currently in my class, we used this left photo. It's a historic photo from the British war photographer Margaret Bourke-White of survivors at Buchenwald in 1945. It also won an award by Life magazine in 1960 as a kind of historical archive. One of the questions is, how does Spiegelman construct his story? And he's going to use personal photographs, but we also discussed how he's using iconic images from the photographic archive of the Holocaust. And what he does in this case, Buchenwald is, of course, a different camp. He's going to redraw this image in which he figures the Jewish people as mice, the Nazis as cats, and the Poles as pigs. Now, we had already discussed a bit that what does he do when he represents the Jewish people as mice, right? In some talks, Art Spiegelman actually has mentioned that he considers Hitler his involuntary collaborator, right? Because he tries to define himself against Hitler, right? Wrest the history of the Holocaust from Hitler. And there is a propaganda film that Hitler devised on the concentration camp of Terezin in Czechoslovakia, in which the Jewish people are represented as vermin, right? And so what Spiegelman does is he takes this Nazi stereotype of the Jewish people as rats and turns it around and offers a kind of sympathetic point of view. At the same time, he also draws on a story by Franz Kafka. Franz Kafka is a very well-known Czech author. You may have read some short stories by Franz Kafka. Franz Kafka has a short story on Josephine the Singer, in which it's a short story that is told from the point of view of a mouse, okay? And it also has very interesting analogies to the Jewish people. And then we also said that within the Jewish tradition of representation, very often figures or humans are not represented as humans, but rather they are represented through animals. And you will have this, we also said in the Haggadah, which is read at the Seder, ceremony. So, so these are all the kind of like different strains that go into having Art Spiegelman draw people, in this case survivors, as MAUS. Now, what I think is very interesting is that if we look at this image of survivors, there is one survivor here in the middle who looks straight in the camera, and one of the questions is really, what's going to happen to these survivors, right? Are they going to live beyond the couple of days of the moment of liberation? They are still behind barbed wire. We also know that the British Army, as the US Army and the Soviet Army, they had no understanding of what these survivors had gone through. So there were no psychological services available. Very often, soldiers would write in the diaries, well, just get your act together and move on, right? Completely misreading and misunderstanding the absolutely horrificness that these survivors went through. And one of the questions is, what will be the future of these people? The State of Israel isn't founded until 1948, so there is literally no place to go. Those who actually survived the days of liberation, and there was rampant typhoid, or folks couldn't eat because their stomachs had shrunk into nothingness. So if they were trying to eat, they would get ill and die, right? So the question is really, what future is there, and is there a future? And you also see, I think it is very, you see, of course, the striped concentration camp, clothing, and you also see these hands, still hanging onto the barbed wire. And the question is, what's going to become of these people, right? They will, with Buchenwald, they are probably, if they survive, they are going to end up in a DP camp in Germany, separated from the German population. They will probably pick up trades, and then they will emigrate, right? So that through these various Jewish organizations. But what Spiegelman does, and I want you to look at this, what he does is he highlights through his comics, and if I say comics, we were talking about how he appropriates the traditional popular culture medium of comics and turns it into a medium for reflection and critical thinking, a kind of like intense investigation of what it means to be looking at images of the Holocaust. And what he does in his comics is that he highlights features from the photographs that are there, but that still require interpretation. For instance, what he does in this image, as you see, he enlarges the eyes of the mice into these expressive, sad, frightened facial expressions that show fear, intimidation. In this case, what it means to shiver. And we also have here this image of this one survivor, with these large hollow eyes, right? So what's happening in redrawing the image is a kind of translation and interpretation in his medium of comics of the desperate and destitute situation, highlighting certain features. But the other thing that's very interesting is this is an image of Buchenwald, which is a different concentration camp. It's close to the city of Weimar. That's the city where Goethe, the German national poet, is from, right? And it's a kind of like parody that, well, here are all the German classics, and right next to it, you have this horrific concentration camp. One of the things that is very important is that here he is going to draw an arrow and put in the words Papa, meaning that, while this is an image of a different concentration camp, he imagines from the perspective of the child of a Holocaust survivor, that his dad maybe was also in a concentration camp, and his dad was in a concentration camp, but in a different one, which was, he was both in Dachau and in Auschwitz. And so what he does is he basically names his dad as a survivor who also stood behind a kind of like barbed wire when he was liberated, right? Okay. So I wanted to, does anybody have any comments or questions on this already? Otherwise, we'll just move on. Thank you. All right. So one of the things is, well, how do you write a comic book, right? Art Spiegelman says it takes a huge amount of time to draw these panels. And so what he had done is he had serialized certain panels and basically tried them on his readership, right? And that's how MAUS came to be. So this was so like a strip that so like came together very slowly over several decades. A lot of the chapters that comprise the 2-volume book were originally in raw, right? And here you see the news titans, and this is an image that we'll talk a little bit later, or here another image about his participation, his dad's participation in war. There are 2 volumes. The first volume is going to be leading up to his father's and Anya's time in Auschwitz. The second volume is literally dealing with life in Auschwitz, and that seems to be a kind of oxymoron. One of the things that is really noticeable is how Art Spiegelman appropriates the Nazi symbol of the swastika, right? So the swastika is going to basically appear as a symbol of domination. In this case, we see here the head of a cat, which is also a skull, and then kind of like a Hitler mustache as the image of evil. Of course, he invokes the image of the cat and mouse to show how mice are trapped. Originally, when Art Spiegelman devised this comic, he wasn't sure of how he wanted to represent the mice in relationship to the cats, and he actually thought of it as a kind of like almost a kind of like horror story, so that the heads would be thrown off in this almost Halloween-like way. But he then decided that this was not the best representation. So here you also see basically on the left-hand side, it's a figuration of his dad protecting. Well, the question is who is really being represented here? Presumably it's Art, right? But in MAUS 1, we actually learned that Art had a brother, Richeux, who was a child who ended up being hidden with a family and sent to the countryside. But then it turned out that that specific location was raided by the Nazis, and the mother, Tasha, decided to basically kill the entire family rather than having them deported into a concentration camp. This is a story that's going to emerge in MAUS 1 itself. We don't know this, and it turns out that in the process of telling us the story, Art Spiegelman finds out he's basically the replacement child of Richeux, his dead brother, who he never knew and of whom there is only a photograph, right? So presumably this is Art Spiegelman. Here again, we have an image of mice, and again in this, frontal, almost close-up vision, it's with the barbed wire, very aptly as this book will mostly deal with the time in the concentration camps. In 1992, Spiegelman won the Pulitzer Prize. And I just want to very briefly talk a little bit about the MAUS mask and the self-portrait. We were talking about how Art Spiegelman represents himself in the book both as a mouse but also with a mouse mask, right? And one of the questions was, what does the mouse mask mean, right? In a certain sense, it's a kind of medium or voice of empathy where he steps into, he imagines being a mouse, being in the world of his father, and literally narrating that world from that point of view. So it's a kind of like device of immersion, but it's also a device that signifies his position of being the child, the son of a survivor who himself has not lived through Auschwitz, right? So there is a kind of mediation that's needed, right? It's a world that's not accessible to him unless he projects himself into this world. But then at the same time, when he projects himself into this world, it is as though he is really reliving it, right? Here we have the Garta, the barbed wire, the chimney, presumably a crematorium, right? It's a world that is immediately present outside as though he was living it, right? It's a kind of, what we could say, a kind of vicarious living, stepping into the shoes of his father. Okay. Now, one of the questions that has come up in relationship to the controversy about whether the book should be banned, why it shouldn't be banned, is the question of what to include in the history of the Holocaust and how to tell the story, right? Some members of the school board said, oh, the story of Auschwitz should be told in a more patriotic way, and which of course raises the question, well, as Spiegelman said, actually Auschwitz was liberated by the Russians, right? And at that point, the Russians were collaborating with the Americans. And if you read accounts of liberation, as we will do later in this class, for instance, by Primo Levi, the liberation was a chaotic event in which literally, because it was a chaotic event because those inmates who had survived had been marched off by the Nazi Germans on death marches to other concentration camps. So there were only those left in Auschwitz who were ill, who were on the verge of dying, and who were basically hardly going to make it, or children who were about to be gassed, right? So the liberation, we also need to be thinking about maybe our desire to turn a catastrophic event that is not redemptive, meaning that this is an event that we need to grasp in its complexity, but also we cannot put a positive spin on it, right? We can't turn it into a happy, so like Hollywood movie. And so for this, and I think this is a very important realization that you can't sanitize or put a happy spin necessarily on the liberation of Auschwitz, right? Although it was a very important event. Again, it was the Soviets that liberated. But in terms of how Art Spiegelman tells the story and why his story was considered so iconoclastic, iconoclasm means if you shatter existing beliefs or ways of representation. One of the questions is, what belongs to this story and from whose perspective, right? And one of the questions is also, what has been traditionally excluded from the story of the Holocaust? And certainly what has been excluded are, if you are thinking of memoirs, these kind of like very personal reflections. Art Spiegelman is going to be telling how before he met Anya, who then became Art Spiegelman's wife and who became Vladek's wife and who was the mother of Art Spiegelman, he had had another affair, and it turns out then he's going to discuss this affair in detail. And one of the questions is, does this belong into the story of the Holocaust? And what separates, or how is the history of the Holocaust always narrated through personal stories? And Spiegelman makes a very powerful pitch for why it should belong, right? And so one of the questions is, why does Art Spiegelman insist on calling into questions all these traditional sanitist ways of telling the Holocaust, where it's all about, history and very selected history, and we should only focus on certain aspects of history. So I realize now that the panels are incredibly small, and I will just point to certain aspects. Okay, so one of the questions is, what belongs in Holocaust history? Here, one of the things that is really important for Art Spiegelman is that the panels represent the present, the past, and very often the future. So what he will give us in a panel like here, in these couple of panels, is how Artie visits his dad, who is now living with his second wife, MAUS, and basically, in Rego Park, right? So that is setting up the story. So this is where much of the recording takes place. He also basically shows that his father doesn't have the greatest relationship to his second wife, and comments on it, they didn't get along, right? And then after the dinner, this is on page 11, if you wanted to look at it, they go to the room in which Vladek has an exercise bike. Now, one of the things that you notice is that Art Spiegelman is going to completely break up the traditional structure of the panels, right? Here, his dad appears, so like huge, taking up most of the panels. And what we see here, of course, very prominently is his Auschwitz number, right? Then he says, so this is the moment where Art Spiegelman says, look, I still want to do this book on you, right? About your life in Poland and the war. And then the dad says it would take many books, and nobody wants to hear anyway such stories, right? And it's unfortunately true. When survivors returned from the camps, hardly anybody wanted to hear the stories. In Israel, when survivors emigrated, they were encouraged not to speak Yiddish on the streets. It was all about, you're now in a new country, try to forget about it. A lot of people did not understand what it meant to come to terms with trauma, right? And that also could explain the high rate of suicides. And then here he says, I want to hear it. Start with Mom. Tell me how you met, right? And then he says, then he starts the story. So I think what is really, really important is that here Vladek becomes almost this overpowering, overwhelming, so like super survivor. He has the Auschwitz number very prominently displayed. And Spiegelman is going to talk about later how he almost, in the presence of his father, who has gone through Auschwitz, shrinks into this tiny boy who almost doesn't feel like an adult in the overwhelming presence of his father, right? So there is this image of the father. Then the father is going to tell sort of like the story of himself and of how he met the mother, but it's going to involve an episode with Lucia of another woman. And so here, here, so this is going on to page 13. a friend of mine would like to be introduced to you. And then we see how Vladek here has these fantasies of being this romance heartbreaker, you know, analogous to a famous actor who was playing in The Shake, Rudolph Valentino, right? And it's interesting that Art Spiegelman represents this because his father does not want him to include these, the affair with Lucia before he met his mother, nor the kind of, you know, his desire and his love life before the war, right? Now, it's interesting. Let's go to the next image. Actually, I'm going to pause for a moment. So I should also mention that the school board took issue with the affair being represented in the comics because they felt it's bad to have a relationship before marriage, right, projecting their own values onto that. But the question is, you know, when we read comics or novels or all kinds of other books, right, these are not books, these are secular books very often, and you can't just censor out everything that doesn't agree with your values, right? You need to, like, look at the world as it is, and then you can make a judgment, right? So one of the things, so if, you know, these private stories, one of the questions is, so what's the status of the private stories? Do they belong or do they not belong in telling his father's stories? And actually, Art Spiegelman says, well, you know what? First of all, he publishes the stories after his father's death. And then Art Spiegelman will argue that he's actually making a pact with the reader, right? It is very important for him that the reader understands the full context of his father's story and not only what his father wishes to be represented, right? It is a kind of effort to also show how, you know, Holocaust survivors had full lives. They're not these sacrosanct people who you want to put on a pedestal and worship, right? They have flaws, and so like love lives like everybody else, and maybe that's exactly what makes them more human, right? And for him, it is very important to bring out the personal dimension. Now, in terms of the question what to include in a graphic novel about the Holocaust, everybody would agree that, of course, this horrific event called Reichspogromnacht, which is often mislabeled as Crystal Night, November 9th to 10th, 1938, in which Nazi paramilitary troops attacked Jewish businesses, apartments, and bodies on the street. And this is basically the date of the Holocaust, that this would, of course, belong in the book. And one of the questions is, how does Spiegelman represent it? He represents it under a section called The Honeymoon, in which the group here is seen to travel to a spa in Czechoslovakia. And the chapter begins with a swastika, right? A swastika that is broken. It already shows us that something is off kilter, that an order is being threatened, that here something, threatens in these threefold breakdowns, threatens a world almost like, like doomsday, right? It's a sign of a future to come, and the mice are kind of like here the unwilling spectators who can just look up at how things are going to unfold, right? And so what Vladek is going to do is he's going to tell the story, or what Art Spiegelman is going to do is he's going to tell the story from the perspective of passing by on a train in Czechoslovakia, which was then annexed by the Nazi Germans, pretending to shield the German population, and that's where the swastika becomes sort of like visible. But okay, look, this is page 32, and at this point, you know, the mice are just looking on it from a train compartment. It's still in safe distance, but on the next page, the kind of like horrificness of the attacks on Jewish shops and bodies are shown in full force. I tell you, there is a pogrom going on in Germany today. Here we see the SS basically, you know, smearing and smashing Jewish businesses, shaming Jewish people. Here, these are basically acts of brutalization and violence, followed then by what is still to come, right? It's very important to keep in mind that all the panels, in a certain way, or most of them imply the past, the present of narration, but also the future. The future still to develop. Here, 1938. Which is the beginning of the Holocaust. All the little Polish villages and shtetls will be, you know, this is a horrible word, will be Jew-free. All the Jews will be annihilated with these villages and in these villages, right? So that's kind of like what we would expect from a graphic novel and memoir. Okay, let's keep going. The other story that, of course, would fit into this, but that Spiegelman tweaks a little bit is the beginning of World War II, September 1, 1939, where the Nazis invade Poland. They invaded with a ruse. They claim that they were attacked by the Polish army, which, of course, they were not, but they used this as a kind of propaganda move, a false flag operation that allows them to invade Poland. And so basically here, so one of the questions is, you know, so how does Art Spiegelman set up the story, right? He is insisting that Tell me about 1939 when you were drafted, right? So 1939, you know, the Polish army that was supposed to defend against the German invasion was overrun within a couple of weeks. They were not trained, really ill-equipped, and they hadn't prepared for an invasion, right? So he says, we were given army trainings for a few days, and then we were sent to the frontier. We are all dug in trenches. And here he's sort of like, this is then how, I want you to also look at the transition of how Spiegelman translates the father's narration into these images. One of the things that is absolutely noticeable up here is then everything went quiet until this morning, and he basically asked him, well, wait a minute, tell me, elaborate a bit on the combat. One of the things I think that is very noticeable is the position of Art Spiegelman with his notebook sitting in front of his father, basically almost assuming the same position as the soldier who's shooting, right? It's, you know, we could also argue that this is a kind of like act of empathetic identification. You know, he wants to be his father. Maybe in the second figure, he imagines himself as his father, as being there with his father, right? And then Vladek will talk about how the dad was always trying to keep everybody out of the army, but his father, you know, he had no choice, right? So I do want to point out that the illustrations and imaginings are always interspersed with the conversations that Art Spiegelman has with his dad. So we cannot really talk here about documentary or a claim to absolute veracity, right? It's the retelling and reimagining of a story, right? And that is also very important. Here we see this is Spiegelman insisting that his dad, who gets sidetracked, gets back to telling the story. And here we see his interaction with a Polish soldier. Poles are represented as pigs, telling him to dig in deeper. It becomes very clear the father had no clue what to shoot. He was just supposed to shoot and dig in deeper, and then he's shooting. So these are certainly images that we would expect. Then I also do want to show you some other images. I'm sorry. Here, so what Spiegelman does is he also gives us, a bit of a kind of history lesson, right? He talks about how Poland, upon the invasion of the Nazis, was divided. Here was the Nazis established what was called a protectorate. It's very interesting that the Nazis always used terms of protection and defense when they were the aggressors, typical moves of perpetrator nations that they invoke that they are the victims when in fact they are the aggressors, right? He also shows how Hitler actually had a pact with the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union would basically take the east of Poland. And I think that's also really important, right? So we also get a map here of Poland. This is Sosnowiec. This is a little town close to Slovakia where Vladek's family was from. And he is talking about how he was taken a prisoner. He was taken a prisoner of war, and they were taken to Lublin. Lublin is here. Lublin actually became, during the communist era, a very important center of Catholic intellectual resistance. It's a very important town. And here, basically, we're here on page 60. This is MAUS 1. This is page 61. They learn that prisoners of war who had been taken by the Nazis basically got killed. And they shot all of them. They killed 600 people. They knew they were Jewish. These were the kind of executions that happened before the systematic deportations in concentration camps. We always think about concentration camps as the primary site of killing. And it becomes clear that they were going to be next. So what basically... And then we see this flashback here to the present of narration. I thought prisoner of wars were supposed to be released. Yeah, well, international law protected us as little as Polish war prisoners, right? But as a Jewish person of the right, you could just be killed on the streets, right? Meaning that in international law, there was no protection for the Jewish people because you basically had been stripped of your nationality, which also means that something like the Genocide Convention is very important. And then he's talking about how he is passing as Polish, and we see that by him putting on the pig mask, asking a Polish soldier to smuggle him back to his town, which he succeeds in doing. All right. So one of the questions is, let's go back to the set of questions we had. Should the history of the Holocaust be sanitized for age-appropriate consumption? And Spiegelman's concern is, what do we do if the argument about age-appropriateness is used to censor panels that call into question parental authority or conflict with their values? And what if parents misread comics because they're not trained in visual literacy, and how can educators help out, right? So that is a very important question. Now, I should say, Spiegelman, as we said, has a pact with the reader, and his father makes very clear right here, he does not want the story of his affairs with Lucia to be included in the book. He says, this has nothing to do with Hitler or the Holocaust. I don't want you to include it in the books. And then Art Spiegelman says, I want to tell you a story the way it really happened, right? And then the father says, but this isn't so proper. It shouldn't be in there, right? And as I said, what really counts for Spiegelman is the pact with the reader. Here we have the stories about his dad not being too happy to include the story. Here he tells the story with Lucia, and this is then the love story with Anya. This is a figuration of Anya, right? So, you know, he gives us a story to basically show us, well, what was his father's life really about? Building empathy, building resilience. So one of the other points is that Art Spiegelman here describes how children, or his son, should be sent to the countryside to potentially survive. Here's Anya saying, I will never give up my baby, never. And then, although later they do send him to the countryside, and here Vladek, in the present, is completely fretting about this decision as he evokes it, almost in a kind of like post-traumatic stress situation. So he says, that his friend and his wife didn't come out from the war, but the son survived, and ours didn't, right? And this refers to Richeux. It's also, this is the moment of post-traumatic reliving. And then he says, anyway, we had to give Richeux to somebody else a year later, but he didn't make it, right? So it's also about the father's stress in the present in retelling the story. This is an image in which he is talking about how they were deported from the ghetto, and how those who had actually given food to neighbors very often ended up being hanged by the Nazis, including the Cohens. And this image has also been critiqued. So you see that these hangings are so unbelievably dramatic that they go over the panels. You know, in the American context, of course, they remind one of lynchings, right? It's a kind of like taboo topic in this country, or of killings in the American West. It has a really, really visceral impact. Also here is the introduction to chapter 4. I'm almost done, so if you can maybe bear with me for another minute. Trying to hide and arriving at Auschwitz. This is, on the right-hand side, again, an image in which Art Spiegelman quotes the gates of Auschwitz, the deportation trucks, how Anya and he were deported to Auschwitz, and then MAUS 2 sets in. Now, one of the questions is, why do we need Art Spiegelman's MAUS? It is an accessible democratic medium that enhances visual literacy. It helps us build skills in how to read about difficult subject matter without feeling overwhelmed, right? Because it's a comic. In a certain way, you step in, but you step out. It is especially suited for younger adults who are in the process of developing reading skills, or folks who may not necessarily have, you know, particularly erudite reading skills yet. You know, folks who may have immigrated. The graphic novel also enables readers to enter at any point into the story, reread it, and pick it up again, right? So, and we also should say that Spiegelman himself feels that comics lend themselves to telling traumatic stories because we process traumatic images visually, right? In images. They also allow for a critical reflection. And we have time frames of the present, past, and future simultaneously, and so they allow the reader to step into the past, step out of it almost as a kind of buffer, right? This is an image, and just very briefly, as we're moving into MAUS 2, about Art Spiegelman sitting at his desk, flies buzzing around his head. There's all this commercial success of MAUS 1. And he is being really weighed down. And the question is, why is he being weighed down? Because he feels it's really unethical to be capitalizing on the Holocaust, right? And then on this page, the next page, we see all these producers who want to turn MAUS into a kind of like infotainment commercial. And in this process, while there are all these demands by the movie industries and the people who want to capitalize, and he shrinks into this little mouse, feeling completely vulnerable and defenseless after he's just produced this, meaning that he's really in need of, he's in serious need of therapy, right? He can't come back from sort of like the power that he has unleashed. Just very quickly, in terms of the family album, this book is also, especially in MAUS 2, a kind of memento mori about who has lived and died. Here we see Vladek being burdened with the photographs having fallen to the floor of all the family members who died. And then, we see these floods of images dropping to the floor. The boundaries of the panel are no longer respected, and that's the end of the slideshow. So I know that some of you may have to leave. If some of you can maybe stay on for a couple of minutes, that would be great, and let's just see whether we have any questions, okay?
In talking about what we need from MAUS, then is its accessibility through the comics, and finally its accessibility to younger people through the comics. In other words, directly opposed to what the school boards are saying is we need to be protected from such things.
Yes, Yes, I would definitely agree, and maybe it might also be really helpful to invite the parents into a discussion of what MAUS is doing. I should mention that following the school board's decision, actually the churches in the area, along with the synagogues, arranged an interview with MAUS. I believe it's also with Art Spiegelman. It's also publicly available, in which exactly this point was made, that you do not want to deprive children or, 8th graders of Holocaust education based on, misreadings or misunderstandings of what's in the book. It's a book with very deep history. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Go ahead. I was struck by your emphasis on the fact that this is a very human story. So what we're teaching them is not necessarily history. History is in the context, but rather we're teaching a human story.
Absolutely.
About what happened to the people. I think that's an important distinction to make here. And probably, again, why people would object to the way in which it's presented. You can imagine many other historical events, too, where we might have a critical view of slaves as complicated people, or World War II heroes as complicated people, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this story is really about personal history and World War II history, right? We can't write Auschwitz out of this. It is so central to the story. And yet, we have to also make very clear that it is filtered through Art Spiegelman's eyes. And once we accept that, I think the story becomes way less problematic, right? And it's, as you pointed out so nicely, it's a story about othering, not only of the Jewish people, but of othering in general, and what happens if we don't take this othering seriously. And it translates into many other historical contexts. I would completely agree. Yes, absolutely.
I've got a question too. It struck me about halfway through listening to you talk, if maybe the reason Spiegelman used the characters, the mice, the cats, all of that, is it was his way, personally, of dealing with a subject that was so huge in his life, and he needed to get it out, but he couldn't do it with real people and with real images, and talking about how he himself needed therapy and he himself had a breakdown, et cetera, et cetera. suddenly became very personal. This is his way of telling his story and his father's story.
Yeah, Beth, I couldn't have formulated it any better. You're absolutely right. It is really about the second generation perspective. It's his trauma, his therapy, what it means to come to terms with the very complicated history of his father, who then he also reproaches his father for burning his mother's diaries, right? So there is the loss of the mother. What it means to be burdened by the history of your parents' trauma and finding a creative therapeutic outlet. But as we move into MAUS 2, it's not clear how therapeutic this really is. I mean, he has to get it out of his system, and it may be he has to exteriorize it, but at the same time, there is still the traumatic burden and almost a kind of like PTSD that needs to be continually addressed. And we also, I think, need to acknowledge that the voice of children, second generation and third generation descendants of survivor has their own autonomous status in representation, right? That is different from the survivor generation. And that's exactly what this graphic novel is about. Thanks.
I was just going to say that I'm a nanny, so I'm around kids a lot. And so I see a lot of like the things that they see on the internet. And with things like YouTube and TikTok and all of those, it's kind of weird that something like this would be banned, but I'm nanny to much younger kids, and they see things that I would say are in different ways worse on the internet. And even if on things like YouTube Kids, it's still like adults posting things that there's a lot of loopholes on how you get things onto these different websites and things that are still accessible and okay for kids to watch. But something like a book for an 8th grader or even beyond can be banned. And I was talking with a mom today, and I mentioned that I was coming here, and she said, oh, yes, I read that book in high school. And I thought it was kind of interesting because she said she couldn't even remember it was the panels that you talked about in class that were seen as more controversy with like the children against the brick wall or like the people being hanged, and she said she doesn't even remember those. She remembers the message she took away from the book. And so at the end of the day, most people don't really hone in on those. They hone in on the overall message. And so I just thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, thank you for your comment. Yeah, the internet is far more dangerous and risky in terms of being, risky for children than reading MAUS. I agree. Thank you so much for your comment. That was fabulous. Anybody in the back? Okay, yeah, wonderful.
I'm really struck by how I remember when this news came out about that Tennessee school district banning the book, and it reminded me of when I got to read it in middle school, and I remember how formative it was for how I learn history and how I continue to learn it. What kind of conversations do you hope younger children reading this book would spark? Do you want those conversations to be with their parents? Do you want it to be among each other? What would the perfect sort of takeaway from this book be in the future if we continue to promote its use in the classroom?
Right. First of all, we should say that after the banning happened, MAUS became freely available on the internet, and we were just talking that there are all these amazing annotated editions now freely available for download with Spiegelman's comments, so there has been this entire proliferation. I think, ideally, what would be nice is to have conversations at the family dinner table, maybe about subjects one may not agree upon, but say, hey, I read this book. This is what I took away from this. What do you think? Have conversations that are unprejudiced and ask questions rather than presuming one knows the answer. One of the issues, I think, with some of the school board readings is that they took what is a creative reimagining as literally documentary, fact-based truth, which Art Spiegelman never says, because he will say, well, you know, I heard this story from somebody else, or this is the way how I imagine it, right? So there is this very careful distancing to any claims that this is the truth, right? And so I do think we need to be very careful about banning things that very often adults, you know, who have read or children who have read these books as adults don't even recall, but rather looking at maybe why parents think something may be controversial, and then they could have a conversation with the child, and the child could also would be entitled to their opinion, right? So rather than shutting down a conversation, and as Spiegelman said, Art Spiegelman is very concerned about, you know, what it means to be insisting on parental authority, which translates into authoritarianism, and that's a literal quote from Art Spiegelman, rather having conversations that could be productive.
One of the things that made me wonder, when MAUS came out in the 80s, think of the age of the people who were reading it. They are the parents of today's generation, but are they the school boards? Are the school boards one generation older who did not read it and who have not read it as a child and who have not read it now because it's so offensive? You know, where's the gap? Anytime, anywhere, somebody bans a book or anything else, my first thought is, well, did you read it cover to cover? Have you actually read it? Are you making an informed decision? So, well, I would, one more.
Hi, yeah, thank you for this talk. I know that MAUS has been translated into many different languages, and it's been circulated across the globe. I was wondering if there was a similar backlash to this book in other countries, maybe in Germany where the topic might be more sensitive, or in other countries where there's kind of similar far-right movements rising up. But yeah, could you just speak a bit more to the reception of this book globally, and whether you see this as an issue not just for the US?
Yeah. Elise, I think this is a really very interesting discussion. I'm not aware of any discussions to that extent. You know, we've had, you know, quite a horrible resurgence of anti-Semitism in Poland, so I wonder whether there is something on MAUS. I think it takes other shapes and forms, like the Poles were not collaborators with the Nazis, so I don't think they would be interested in taking on MAUS. No, I think it's a uniquely US phenomenon, which also, of course, has to do with questions of, you know, education, readership, public engagement, and certain levels of secular education.
Say one more thing. The thing that this reminds me of is not only are we surprised and very disturbed by the criticisms of school boards and other right-wing people, but I think the book raises the question of how do we all handle the past? One could imagine that should those people still be alive, and at least their children are alive, in Israel, how are they dealing with such a honest portrayal of the lives of the father and the kind of difficulties between father and son, and the difficulties of handling this truth? As you said, after the war, people wanted to forget it. They didn't want to forget it because they didn't believe it. They wanted to forget it because they did believe it. It was too terrible to look at. And so there's many kinds of reasons why people might want to ban the book.
Mm-hmm. Right. I mean, Israel, you know, it's the country of Holocaust survivors. You know, MAUS, you know, would never evoke a reaction of being banned. It's completely unthinkable, right? I do think, unfortunately, it is a U.S. phenomenon, and MAUS is not the only book that is being banned, to put it mildly. And so I guess we would need to have discussions about what we want to include in high school curricula, right? And there are certain states that, on the subject of the Holocaust, argue that you have to teach both sides. I mean, so. Such in the state of Texas, right? And I worry about what it means to be teaching the other side. So I think it really goes to the issue of public education and conversations that are free from ideological prejudice. Maybe it'd be nice to have a new openness where we meet and talk to one another rather than shutting things down. It's never a helpful approach for democracy to be censoring books or banning books, right?
Well, I would like to thank you all for coming, and those of you watching online, thanks for joining us. And thank you, Elke. This was very eye-opening and makes me want to go read it again.
Thank you so much,
Thanks.
Beth. Thank you.